Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, and welcome to this week's live chat. I'm so excited you're joining me to talk about one of my favorite things, quilting. I wasn't here last week, sorry I missed you all. I was teaching a 2-day long arm boot camp here at our event space and having a blast, but missing you guys as well. If you've ever wanted to take a hands-on deep dive into long arming, you should check out my boot camps. It's lots of fun. If you're in the Kansas City area anyway, check out the website for the events on that. But anyway, I'm back today and I'm going to talk about design ideas for quilt blocks. And I'm kind of matching two things up together. So we have Build a Quilt, which is our block of the month program, and we're kind of finishing up this year's Build a Quilt. And so I usually try to give them quilting design ideas for their blocks. And so in this chat, it's kind of Build a Quilt blocks, but I'm putting a live chat spin on it and telling you a little bit about ideas for picking out designs. But then I'll tell you about how you can get some fun stuff too. Anyway, if you're watching live, I have a giveaway for you today. So leave a comment on here and Jessica will pick a lucky winner at the end. And if you're watching live, you have a question about free motion quilting or anything in general, definitely put that in the comments because she'll give those to me at the end. Now, what am I giving away, you ask? I mean, let's be honest, it doesn't matter what I'm giving away, you probably want it, right? Now, I'm giving away a quilt panel with blocks on it. I'm gonna explain this to you here in a minute, but I have a fun little panel that has the blocks on there, so lots of details about that. Before we get to it though, I just want to give you a heads up that in November, we're starting the Season's Greetings video series. If you've watched my live chat before, you have already heard this a bunch. I'm so excited. In fact, if you're wondering about the festive background here, it's because I've been filming for that. If you have been on the fence on whether or not you want to order a panel, I've got to encourage you to go ahead and get your order in because we are almost sold out. And so definitely check that out if you want to take advantage of it. And through that video series, just in case you're not sure what I'm talking about, we're going to learn how to quilt. Oh, crap. Sorry, my slides are out of order. We're going to learn how to quilt this adorable panel right here, and I'm going to make it into some different projects. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Again, you can figure out all the details on that. Sorry, guys. So we're going to be jumping around. You get to look at my my photo screen here in a second. This is not the picture I want. All right, so what am I talking about today? I'm so glad you asked. Like I said, I'm gonna be talking about design ideas for blocks for Build a Quilt. Now, it doesn't matter if you're not a part of Build a Quilt, that's kind of a separate thing. But when it comes to picking out quilting designs for our quilt blocks, that can be tricky. And so what I have here are just some pictures of the quilted blocks. I went through and kind of quilted all of them. I'm just gonna give you some ideas to think of, or kind of what I was thinking when I was quilting them. Now, here you can see the little quilts I have. I may have cheated a bit and made this into a panel. Let's be honest, I didn't really have time to piece more blocks. Joni had pieced the block she had made into the finishing kit, so I printed a panel with the blocks on there and quilted it. And so that's what the giveaway is going to be, a panel in one of the 3 colorways. I'll show you what that looks like at the end. But whether you're quilting sampler quilts or you're quilting quilts with just one block, sometimes when you have those more complex piece blocks or blocks with a lot of pieces to it, it can be tricky to decide how to quilt it. Now, really when it comes down to it though, there's no wrong way to quilt your blocks. You can pick any designs, you can do it all over the whole thing. But sometimes it's fun just to see, all right, what worked for me and what designs were we going with there. So first up, let's check out this block. So Build a Quilt has 10 different blocks. So these are just blocks that we have been making throughout the year. But if you're not a part of Build a Quilt, we're just going to kind of talk about some things that can apply to other blocks you have as well. So there's definitely some takeaways here for you as well. Now, when I'm looking at any quilt, especially sampler quilts or quilts with lots of different blocks, decision fatigue can set in really fast. You know, what happens is like you have to decide how to quilt one block and then dang, you have to do it for a different one. You never really kind of get into a groove. One of my favorite things to do right off the bat is to establish a background area. So in this particular example, that light cream fabric is the background. And once I've established that, I'm gonna quilt the same design in all of those areas. Now, the background doesn't have to be the same fabric. It could be, you know, this part of a block, because sometimes, you know, blocks have scrappier backgrounds. We don't have to do difficult stuff over the whole quilt to make it impactful. So don't feel like you have to like do crazy things everywhere. By taking that background and just doing a design that's easy for you, something that you feel comfortable doing, it's gonna take a lot of the decision off your plate right off the bat. Plus, it's gonna give you a time to kind of relax into the quilting. So if you have seen any of my videos or heard me talk at all, you know I love swirls. I'm a swirl girl, so in the background area, I'm gonna quilt swirls of these blocks. Now that doesn't mean that I can't change that up. If you've made the rule, then you can definitely break the rule, but sometimes just having a rule to follow makes it a little bit easier. Now beyond that, when I start looking at the individual blocks, I'm going to use a lot of dot-to-dot quilting, which is those geometric diagonal lines you can see kind of in those darker orange triangles and in the lighter orange triangles, and then some continuous curve, which is a line that curves from points to points, and you can see that towards the center of the block, whether it's the more motif looking in the green or that simple continuous curve design in the center block. Those two, you can pretty much quilt any quilt block by using variations of them. So that's kind of like my automatic go-to, because it's just going to make it a lot easier to pick designs. I can quilt those curves in a lot of different ways, and I can quilt those diagonal lines in a lot of different ways. So for instance, looking at those darker orange triangles, I've quilted wedges that kind of extend from where those triangles meet. I love using the quilting to draw your eye to certain points of the block, and in this particular example, it was just quick and efficient for me to do that. But then when I got to the center of the block with those light orange triangles, I just did a simple dot-to-dot design that went from one side to the other. Now, what I love about both of these techniques is you can make them as complex as you want. If I wanted to add more lines, I could have. If I wanted to add a filler, I definitely could have. I could have done more to it if I wanted to. Really, for me, where I kind of fall on that is if the fabric is busy and you can't see the quilting a whole lot anyway, I tend to keep the quilting a little bit more simple for me. I like to save my quilting where you can kind of really see it. Now, one thing that you might notice right off the bat is, well, if you can see, it's dark green thread that I'm using. So in this example, I knew that I wanted to quilt the blocks so I could take pictures of them and make diagrams out of them and let you see them. Using that contrasting thread is what lets you see the quilting, although it's probably not going to be ideal when you're actually working on a quilt. So if you look at this and you're like, wow, she was brave, she used dark green thread, just know it was for a particular purpose. But no matter what designs you work with, continuous curve or that dot-to-dot design, you're going to deal with shapes that maybe aren't quite what you're used to. And you can see with that, busier print, it kind of makes this different shape. It's like a square and another square on point. And when that happens, I resort to my best quilting friend, echoing. I feel like sometimes people are going to look at all the quilts I've done and be like, oh, she does like the same 3 designs over and over again, and then nobody's going to be impressed anymore. But until then, I'll just keep doing this. But if you look through these pictures, you'll see there's not a lot of different designs, just this design's used in a lot of different ways. So in that print, it might be hard to see because it's a busier fabric, doing some echoing that follows the sides of the block. I added 2 echo lines, but I could have added more if I thought that looked better. So it's just kind of a fun way to highlight those portions of your block. Now let's look to the next one, because sometimes we have more of those shapes and things that we're working with that aren't easy to work with. So in this particular block, this was tricky, probably one of the trickier blocks to quilt, because there's a lot of different things going on, right? The fabric, that dark orange, almost makes a star in the center, but not quite. The print that makes the V's on the corner don't really come together with anything else. I love the look of the block, but from a quilting standpoint, it did provide a little bit of a challenge. And it's kind of funny because I designed the block, so I have nobody but myself to blame for that. But let's talk about the light green corners first. In that particular shape, I wanted to use some echoing just to kind of highlight the corners of the block, but really it also took that space and made it a little bit easier to manage. Now, all these blocks are 12 inches, so they're not huge spaces that I'm dealing with, and especially if you're looking on a screen, it kind of might look bigger or smaller depending on what you're looking at, but that's kind of the size we're working with. So in those green areas, I could have just done those diagonal lines, to really draw attention to the corners, but I added some echo lines just to shrink that space down a little bit and give it a little bit more complexity. Again, I could have left out the diagonal lines. I could have added more echoing. I could have done a lot of different things, but I kind of like how it just kind of, puts the parentheses around it. Now look at those triangles on the side, those light cream triangles. Remember I said, on all the cream fabric, I'm going to do a swirl. Well, this is the perfect example of when I broke my own rule. Here I just added some dot-to-dot designs. That's a pretty small area, and sometimes it's trickier to fill in a filler in that's like a 2x4 triangle. So sometimes just skipping it all together might make it a little bit easier. Plus, I like how it just kind of repeats what's in the corners of that green fabric. Now, in the busier print, you can't see it, but I quilted some serpentine lines. And let me tell you, they're the best serpentine lines I've ever quilted. They are spectacular. Oh, well, you wouldn't know if I was lying, right? And I just might be lying. I'm being silly, of course. But in those busier fabrics, again, if I can't see the quilting, I'm going to do something that's easy for me. Now, you might be listening and you might be like, nobody thinks serpentine lines are easy. Well, I kind of like quilting them, so that's a go-to for me. But you can kind of wrestle with that and find what you like. Well, there in the light orange is that continuous curve again. So the same idea, just in a different block, repeated a couple times. This particular continuous curve that just goes from corner to corner to corner is like the most basic continuous curve. You can, of course, change it up and create some variations, which we're going to see here in just a little bit. But for those 2-inch squares where I didn't need anything too fussy there, I just kind of kept it nice and simple. Now, I have done videos on continuous curve before, and if you've watched it, you probably know what I'm going to say. I'm not worried so much that those curves are perfectly the same all the way around the block. Instead, I'm trying somewhat to make them land on the corner as close as I can, and then continuing on. Even in this example, where I have this one block and we're zoomed in on it, it's kind of hard to tell if it's not perfect, but especially when you kind of back up and you look at the whole quilt, you're not going to see if one is or isn't perfect. So try not to obsess too much about that as you're quilting. Then in the center, I decided to pull some of those fabrics together and go ahead and quilt it as though it was a star kind of shape. Now, this might be, I won't say controversial because there's nothing controversial in quilting. This might not be what you would like to do, but in it I thought, I'm going to use that dot to dot or that diagonal kind of geometric shape and kind of quilt it so it extends from there like as though it was a star. So in the light tan, you might see a little bit of that quilting. I just kind of thought it was fun to treat it that way. You don't have to quilt each fabric differently. I mean, for the most part, I do, right? If somebody has taken the time to piece 2 different pieces of fabric, I'll quilt them separately. But sometimes you can use the quilting to group them together. So you can use the quilt block as a guide, or you can disregard it altogether and just do what you want, right? It's like, I'm gonna do what I want. All right, now, it's kind of funny because as I'm quilting these blocks, I'm kind of thinking through, what am I gonna teach and how are the diagrams gonna look? But sometimes it's like, the easy option is sometimes the best option. And this particular block is a little bit, kind of has a little curved look, has a busier print. And I took a second, like, I don't know what I'm going to do in here. I can do like a feather. And at the end, I realized I'm just going to do some echo lines. I'm going to add a few more echo lines in each of the sections. I'm going to quilt them so they overlap where those blocks come together in like the tan kind of brown corners. And I just loved how it looked. So I think sometimes like holding back and not throwing everything at a block, for me especially, can be difficult, but sometimes, just kind of stopping and not keeping on. Because, I love to quilt things until they're dead. Quilt it till it has too much and add more has always been my motto. But there we can see how I try to keep it a little bit more simple. And even in that light orange fabric, that's about an inch finished strip, I didn't quilt anything in it. I just kept it nice and simple. So again, it doesn't have to be difficult to be impactful. Now, I'm echoing inside the blocks, but in this example, I also echoed outside of the blocks. And in this way, I'm kind of using it to separate it from the filler that it's around. So, of course, definitely optional to leave it out. But in this example, I like how it kind of just separates it just a bit. Plus, I like echoing, so that always works good for me. But I will say, probably the hardest blocks to quilt are ones like this that are made up of smaller triangles and squares. Not because they're difficult, but because there are so many different options. You can quilt this in so many different ways. I could combine those triangles and quilt it as one big triangle. I could do the dot to dot, like you can see here, that geometric. I can do continuous curve. And sometimes the more options you have, the harder it is to decide how to quilt. So good luck with that. But in this example, you can see that just simple diagonal line in those half square triangles. Especially when I'm working with a block like this, if it's pieced perfectly, I love to use the quilting to draw attention to those corners. Probably because I'm not the best piecer, and when I'm quilting somebody's quilt who is, I like to show that off. So you can kind of see that in that area. But in the corner blocks that have the strips and the bigger triangles in the corners, there you can start to see the continuous curve variation. And if you have quilted continuous curve or worked with this at all, you've seen this as well. But it's just a different way to quilt those curved lines so they fit that different shape. And in this example, they're fitting in that triangle. Another benefit to it is that it starts from one side of the triangle and ends on the other. So it allows me to move on and continue quilting, as opposed to the ones that are in the square where I come back to where I start. It's hard to really kind of explain all the things I'm thinking. Nobody needs to see what's in my brain while I'm quilting, because there's a lot of loud noises and crashing sounds. But when I'm quilting, I'm trying to pick designs that will get me where I need to go, right? Where do I need to go? And then I'll pick a design that does that. If you're like, hold on, I'm still trying to learn how to quilt and breathe at the same time, just trust me, that comes with practice. And then here we're finally going to see another design, right? We're going to see some wishbones, and that's that design that's in that cream kind of strip there. So echoing the block a little bit and then adding that wishbone design in there. Wishbones are another super versatile design because it works in, anywhere from 2 to 4-inch strips, and you can even fit it in irregular areas as well. And so here I was just probably getting a little tired of quilting straight lines, and I thought, you know what, let's do a little something different. So definitely a great way to add some texture to part of your block. Now, anytime you have a part of your block that you add a lot of quilting to, that's where the attention is going to go, especially with this green thread. So doing that, I don't think it takes away from the block, but you can tell it definitely kind of draws attention to that area. So great design to use if some of the piecing in the block isn't perfect and you kind of want to not show that off. So it's kind of funny because usually I'm trying to hide some of my mistakes that I've been working on. All right, what about this block? So this particular one was the very first block of Build a Quilt, which was about a year ago. Those of you that are watching the live chat that are doing Build a Quilt with us, isn't it crazy that we have been through so much? In this particular block, we see a lot of squares and triangles, nice and basic, nothing difficult piecing wise, but I wanted to use quilting designs that had direction to them. This is totally optional, but I just kind of like the look of the designs that kind of follow the lines of that square. If I had quilted that basic kind of continuous curve design in those smaller squares, it would have looked stunning. I wouldn't have been mad about it, but it doesn't really have a direction. So in this example, I'm quilting the designs so that they kind of follow the directionality of that block. Now, in this particular example, this sampler quilt, this is the only one of these blocks that we have. So really not a big deal. But if I'm working on a quilt that has a lot of these, like let's say an Irish chain quilt, or a quilt with setting blocks that makes, kind of like a cross, using directional designs will help highlight the look of that. So it's really tricky when people say, oh, how do you quilt a 4-patch block? Well, it depends. What is that block doing in the rest of the quilt? And in this example, I'm pretending that it's part of a bigger picture. So sometimes kind of stepping back from just the block and looking at that overall secondary pattern can kind of help give you those design ideas. And then in the busier prints, you can't really see it, but I just did some of those geometric wedges that we saw in the first block I showed you. So a way to kind of change it up a bit. Now, I kind of joked that, if you make a rule, you can break a rule. And having rules, rules is such a strong word. I'll say guidelines or things I do. This is what I do. And having something to follow kind of makes the decision making easier, right? So one of my rules is if I've quilted one design, like let's say a geometric dot-to-dot design, and I need to pick another design, I just pick the opposite of the one I've just quilted. So if I've done a lot of geometric in a block, I'll do curvy in the next one. I think it's because I'm easily bored. Well, I don't think. I know it's because I get easily bored. But I know that I can also break that rule. I don't have to do it. So don't feel like those rules are meant to hinder you. They're just to give you something to follow. Now, in this particular block, we have the fabric that works its way around the outside, kind of adding the frame. This was probably my favorite block of the whole year. To be honest, it's hard to say that because I'm always like, oh, but this one was my favorite one. But I did like how it kind of was a chopped off looking square. Remember, I'm not a great piecer, so this one, perfect. It's like I don't have to worry about the star points because they're kind of cut off up there. But it did pose a little bit of a problem because of that weird kind of shape. That dark orange fabric around the outside was just a weird kind of space. So first I used echoing around the outside and then added some dot-to-dot designs, so some diagonal lines that connect different points. It took me a second to figure out how I was going to quilt it, but finally it clicked. So really with those weird shapes, use echoing. I could have kept echoing that shape and then try those versatile designs that you like to use in a lot of ways. And then you can kind of see some continuous curve in there, some echoing, and you can see around the outside in those triangles, those light cream triangles, I have some continuous curve with just 2 sides of the block curved. So instead of going all the way around that triangle, I just did one to the next. Can you guess why? Because it helped me move on to the next point. I didn't want to come back to where I started. And that means even if I have to leave part of the design off, I'm okay with that. Once is a mistake, twice is a design choice. So as long as you do the same thing on all of the blocks, it's going to look fine. At least that's what I tell myself. And, I can convince myself of almost anything. Now, speaking of, directional designs, in that last block, we saw how you can use continuous curve directionally, use that dot-to-dot quilting directionally. Well, if you look at that cream kind of square in the center of the block, in this example, I don't really want directional, but I wanted that dot-to-dot design. So I quilted it twice so that overlapped each other, just to kind of create that more motif looking design, because I didn't want it to go a direction. So, you know, if you don't want directional, just go both ways, and it kind of makes just your general kind of motif. Again, this block was a lot of fun to quilt, and then those little curves in the corners too. Too cute. All right, hold on, more blocks. This particular block, Build-A-Quilters haven't seen yet, because this is going to be this month's block. It's actually not this weekend, but next weekend, we're going to see this kind of star shape. And normally, I love to quilt stars, and normally in stars, I'm doing that, you know, dot-to-dot design. I'm doing some continuous curve, but this particular star is kind of wraps around. And finally, I have a space that's big enough for the petals of a feather. Usually when I look at a quilt, I'll ask myself, is there enough room for a feather or not? And if there is, I'll try to get something feathered in there. In this particular example, I quilted just one side of the feather and used those seams as a guide to quilt along it. So this might be a little bit more advanced for those of you that are like, I don't quilt feathers. I could have just done some more, you know, diagonal designs, or those dot-to-dot designs. I could have done some continuous curve or echoed. All of that would have looked great. But in this example, I wanted to add a little bit of curvy look to it. Now, it's funny because sometimes I'll have quilters ask, oh, if it's a pointy block, should I use a pointy design to highlight the points of it, or should I use a curvy design for contrast? And the answer is yes. Sometimes I want to add some curves because I'm tired of quilting points. Sometimes I want to do pointy. There's no wrong way to do this. So if you're like, oh, it's a pointy block with curves, great. It has some juxtaposition. If it's a pointy block with points, great. It highlights the piecing. There really is no wrong way to do it. So in this particular example, I was like, yes, I finally get to fit a feather in there. And then, of course, there's those diagonal lines again, filling in those weird kind of trapezoid shapes. And then this particular block, I think this is our last one. We can see a lot of different things going on with this. It's kind of like that other block where I said it's not quite finished. Like there's kind of a frame around the block, but it's broken up by those other pieces. And so sometimes, you know, stepping back and thinking, all right, what do I want to echo and how can I highlight that? So there's some ribbon candy in there. It's funny because in the type chat before we started, Susan typed in and said, I watched the ribbon candy video tutorial that you had again, and it finally clicked. So I know not everybody loves that ribbon candy, that curvy kind of shape that's in that light orange, but it is definitely one of those designs that click. It's like, I don't got it, and then your brain finally figures out how to do that flip, and then it clicks. So if you're struggling with it, just keep going, because I promise it will click. As opposed to other designs like swirls that kind of get refined each time you do it. So there you go for that. But there you go, we have some echoing. We have some continuous curve, a little bit more complex looking in the corners there, just because I have more space to overlap them. And then some more of those, you know, geometric kind of shapes. But again, quilting those kind of dense swirls in the background, just kind of squish it down and make it work. One of the questions that came up was, you know, somebody asked on the type chat, is there an app where you can audition quilting designs? And if you know of one, please leave it in the comment section. I've not heard of one. I myself like to take a picture of the quilt and then just draw on it on my phone. But I will say, the more often you quilt blocks, the more you'll be able to envision what it will look like. I have used the continuous curve design a lot over the years, and I know it's going to work perfectly in those triangles. So it's not something like, you know, you're born knowing. It just comes with practice. So if you're like, oh, how do you come up with those designs? I promise it does come up with practice. All right, so to go back to that panel that I have. So one of the questions that Build-A-Quilters usually have is, you know, will I have quilting diagrams for the designs? And I do. Actually, I've put together some downloadable quilting diagrams for the blocks. And those of you that are in Build-A-Quilt, you will definitely see this in an email coming out. But if you're like, oh, I want to see kind of how she quilted all those blocks, you can get the downloadable quilting diagrams. I think they're like $2.99. They're super cheap for all 10 blocks, and they have step-by-step and pictures in there. But if you purchase a block panel, I did make some block panels. I got to find my picture right here. We have the block panels for sale as well. So if you're wondering about the 3 colorways, those are the 3 different color options that we offered for Build-A-Quilt. So this one was, you know, pumpkin season. And then you can see the beautiful embellished, which is that gold and taupe, and then bloom and blush, which is the pink and navy. So we have the panels available for sale. If you're like, you know what, I want to try quilting this. I want to give some blocks a shot, but I don't want to worry about piecing the blocks. If you purchase the panel, you'll automatically get the quilting diagrams emailed to you for free. So you can either just do the diagrams for those of you that have pieced all the blocks, or those of you that are like, you know what, I want to practice some designs, you can get them with the panel. Either way. And all you have to do is click the link in the description box below to get all the information about that. But really, when it comes to quilting blocks of any kind and any size, the best thing to think about is how can I work my way around this block in the most efficient way, and what designs will help get me there. Again, in the beginning, it's going to be like, oh, I don't know how that works, but I promise it will get there. If you're watching live, be sure to write your questions. Looks like Jessica has some for me, but there were a couple of questions that came up in the type chat, so I wrote those down. About half an hour before I go live, I get on the YouTube video and we just type and chat, and I write down questions if anybody has some good ones. Somebody asked, Saya asked, what's the trick to getting rounded designs on a long arm quilting machine? She's trying and it's more squared off. Congratulations, you're completely normal. When you're working on a long arm, you're dealing with two sets of wheels going a different direction, and just getting comfortable moving through those with confidence is what will help you get those rounded curves. If you're getting squared corners, look at it as though you are 3/4 of the way there. You know how the design goes, you're just learning how to move through it with confidence. So just the more confident you get, the easier it will become. Another thing that will help is continue with your momentum. I know sometimes when we're quilting, we want to stop, look at what we've done, feel bad about it, cuss Angela for making it look so easy, and then go back to it. But if you just keep going, that momentum will help carry you through a lot of those curves. And then one last tip, because nobody wants to hear practice as the answer to their question. If you have been practicing and you're like, no matter what, it is not working, try changing up your stitch settings. I like to quilt in manual mode, which does not use a stitch regulator, and I think sometimes some quilters can get curvier corners with those, so you can try that and see if that helps, hopefully. Kathy is making a flannel quilt for her very loving sister, and you want to know what to put in the center of her flannel. And this is totally up to you, but anytime I'm quilting a quilt, whether it's flannel on top and bottom or minky, it's getting batting inside of it, because my tension is set up for 2 layers of fabric and batting. That's the main reason. I just think it's easier to get tension right because it's already set up. But you could totally put another layer of flannel in there or leave it out if you'd like. But like I said, I like to put the batting in there. All right, one last question. I'll answer the ones that Jessica's been writing down. Jean had a great question. She said, I've been watching old episodes of the Midnight Quilt Show. Loves the quilts, wants the patterns. What's the secret? All right, y'all. So Midnight Quilt Show is not owned by me. It's owned by Craftsy. And Craftsy was Craftsy, and then it got sold to Blueprint, and then it got sold to a new company called Craftsy. And those patterns, as far as I know, did not go along with it. So as far as I'm aware, those patterns are gone. So you can email Craftsy customer service. They might have a different answer, but for all intents and purposes, they're just out there kind of showing you what you can make, but there's no patterns as far as I know. So sorry to be the bearer of horrible news there. But I do have episodes of the Midnight Quilter, which are now owned by me and on my YouTube channel, so you can see that as well. All right. From Teresa, can you give us an update on how things are going in your Long Arm Education Center? So that's fun. Last year, I showed kind of behind the scenes of our beautiful long arm room. A room with 6 full-size long arm quilting machines, all my class samples, everything I need to teach. It is amazing. I love it. And so we've been doing kind of quarterly classes. That's where the training happens for our long arm owners, and then where the boot camps and things go to as well. Having traveled and taught, I love to travel and I love to teach, but to be able to do it at home and hands-on on a long arm is not the norm. So it's a lot of fun to kind of teach on that. And I will say, this was not the question, but if you've ever looked at a long arm class and you're like, I don't have a long arm, should I take the class? Absolutely. Yeah, you don't have to have one or have ever used one. In fact, I prefer quilters come in never having touched one because I can form them how I want them. They don't have any bad habits. But the Education Center is great. And if you're ever in the Kansas City area, I hope you'll pop in because it looks so beautiful. All right, Lorena, any ideas for quilting 5x5 squares? Oh, charm squares, so great, right? I mean, so easy to piece, but not quite big enough for a feather, but too small to leave with just a basic continuous curve. In that example, I really would want to know what's going on in the rest of the quilt, because usually there's multiple. One quick way I'll say is sometimes I like to quilt an X in that square, kind of break it up into 4 smaller triangles, and then quilt some different designs in those triangles. Depending on how you orientate the designs, you'll get some cool motifs out of them. So that's kind of one of my favorite ways, breaking that block down into smaller pieces and then quilting it. So hopefully that helps. One day I'll have to put this aside. I have a side of a pile of questions. That might be a good little live chat topic. Tips for quilting with a newborn, toddler, and preschool. Will I ever quilt again? Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. It is so hard with little ones. There is a life balance. And I can say that I know this from experience because I got my first long arm when my oldest son was 6 months old. I like to say that if I had got my long arm first, I would not have children. Jessica would not be an auntie to my kids, but they were grandfathered in. So a lot of the quilting I did for the first 15 years was very limited. And, I just carved out the time I could, nap time, for an hour at night. But I will say this, it really did help create the type of quilter I am, because I didn't have time to obsess about it or worry about it if it was perfect. It was like, go in, I've got half an hour, I'm quilting balls to the wall. Sorry for the pun there, but so you just get in when you can. And you won't probably be able to start a quilt from start to finish, but just going in for 10, 15 minutes, a little bit just to carve that time out for you, I think is so important. I know it's hard, especially when you have 3, like a newborn, toddler, and preschooler. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit before you can quilt, but it does get easier. And I always thought once my children got bigger, I would get more quilting done. But you really don't. It's just weird. Now I have a 22-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 16-year-old. They don't want anything to do with me for the most part. I mean, they do, but they don't require as much effort. But I'm not getting much more done. So it's kind of funny how that works. So good luck, Joanna. I promise it gets better. I like to say quilting is for people with lots of time and, expendable income. And you're just a little bit on the time right now. So you just kind of carve that out when you can. Okay, Tony, for your new panel, can you give suggestions on what coordinating fabrics we might require? So I guess we're talking about the block panel. In the listing, there's an optional backing kit. So you can put backing and binding on it. If I'm thinking off the top of my head, it's like round 42 by 54-ish. So you would need about, I can't remember the exact yardage, but it's on there. You can look and see what the backing is. You don't need a whole lot, I guess is what I'm saying. Ginny, I could use some tips on using rulers on my sit-down machine. My hands cramp up when I try to keep my ruler steady. I'm not laughing at the joke. I'm just like, yeah, I know what that feels like. You're like, ugh. One thing that will really help when quilting with rulers on your sit-down machine is to be high, not high, but sitting up high so that you can push down on those rulers. What happens is if you're too low, you can't use gravity on your side and your hands kind of cramp up really bad. Another thing is to pause. I mean, you're not going to be able to quilt in long lines without stopping. So pause, kind of take your time and reposition it, and hopefully that will help. It will get easier, I promise. I feel like that's a lot of what I do in the live chat. Just practice, it gets easier. But really having that higher posture will help, and then just knowing it gets easier. And when I'm quilting on my sit-down machine, I have a ruler on one side of the foot, I have my hand on the other. I'm using both hands, just one happens to be holding onto a ruler. So don't forget about the other hand. And if you're like, that's not going to help me, no worries. My next free motion challenge quilting along, which I'm going to announce sometime next month, is going to be about rulers. We're going to see how to use arcs, curves, and pointy rulers. So we're going to talk about that. What color thread did I use on the sampler quilt? That's a great question, and one I should know the answer to. It's dark green, but I don't remember the exact color of it. I don't know. Dark green, but that's not the name. I'm sure it was something prettier than that. I'll look it up and see if I can leave it in the comments for you. How did I start the wishbones on that angle? Great question, Karen. I should have showed that. So I'll do a little, maybe next week I'll show you this. I'll do a little thing, but it's like you're in the corner and you don't have much room. You just kind of swing out and begin your bitty wishbone and then get out of there. So the trick is their timing kind of stretched out and then get to where I have space. But I'm going to set that aside as well to work on that. Great question, Karen. I should have thought to answer that. All right, Mary, tips for quilting designs in a Bargello style quilt. So a Bargello quilt has that beautiful flow of fabric. So cool. They're not as difficult to piece as they look. There's a trick. But when it comes to quilting, kind of tricky because if I were to highlight each individual block, it's not going to give me that beautiful flow. So I'm going to pick designs that kind of follow that flow of fabric. And I have a quilt on the top of my head that I will take a picture of and I'll show you next week. I'll put a little star next to that one. So we'll kind of have follow-up to these questions. But basically, in that example, I quilted feathers that kind of followed it, or wavy kind of lines that kind of follow it. So something that follows the look of it. I will say with Bargello, they're so stunning and so graphic and beautiful that honestly, even if you just do an overall kind of simple design, it'd be great because your eye's going to look through that and just see the beautiful piecing there. But I'll show you some examples next week. Jenny, would you add any background quilting for background colored blocks inside a block? So yes, we kind of saw some examples. I didn't really point that out. In some of those background colored blocks, like in the center, sometimes I did a continuous curve, but in that last block I did background fabric. It just depended on how big that block is. If it's a 2-inch square in the center of the block, I have a hard time quilting swirls in there, and so I might just do a continuous curve. So it's kind of that idea that I'm not always letting the fabric depict what's going, but for the most part I am. But honestly, it's like if you're feeling up to it, do it. If you're not, then don't. Love it. Okay, from Robin, is there a trick to quilting pieced quilts on a domestic machine in regards to thickness? So, yeah, so especially if you have bulky seams or quilts with a lot of seams, think of those as little speed bumps that your free motion foot gets to go around. One thing that can help if you have one with lots of bulky seams, I don't think I have the right foot here. I like to use a foot, I don't have it handy. I like to use a foot that's a dynamic free motion foot. So it kind of hooks on your bar and it almost bounces as you quilt. And that little bit of a hop will allow you to move the quilt underneath as you're quilting. You don't usually see me quilt with one because it's kind of more like a oval kind of foot. And I like to use something more round for echoing. But if I were quilting a quilt, like let's say that Bargello with all those seams, I might switch to that just because that hopping motion makes it a little bit easier to quilt. For your free motion foot, if you have though like an adjustable height one, you can try raising your foot up just a bit. You'll know you've raised it up too far if you start getting skip stitches. So once that happens, you have to kind of lower it back down. But that's something that we see also when people start putting their ruler foot on there. So you can raise it up a bit. If you start skipping stitches, lower it down a bit. If you don't have that capability, try that foot that kind of hops. And then on a long arm, really doesn't matter because that long arm quilting machine has that hopping foot and it will glide over just pretty much anything. So hopefully that helped, Robin. All right, thanks everybody for joining me. I kind of rambled on there a little bit, but I think it's kind of fun just to see some quilt blocks and talk about design ideas. If you have any questions and you weren't watching live, leave them in the comment section because I get on there from time to answer them, and it's just kind of fun to see, what everybody else thinks about the designs. And Lori Deal, you are the winner of our panel. So you get the block panel in your colorway of choice. So you get a pick, but what you have to do to claim that is to email us at customerservice@quiltingismytherapy.com and we'll get that out to you. So drop us an email and we'll get it out to you. Now, I know it's been a crazy week. I hope everybody stays safe. I'll see you next week for another live chat. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.